Chapter 10 The Great Turkey Walk. Things kind of went smooth then for a while, past Independence, which we steered clear of, and into the Kansas Territory. Funny thing about Jabez, as we got near and near to that territory, he got jumpier than a bullfrog in high croaking season. "Mr. Peace, sir," he kept hounding the man at every opportunity. "Are we there yet?" "Well," Mr. Peace would answer, "first off, we got to get past Westport." "Then, after Westport, will there be some line? Sort of a mark across the road to point out the end of Missouri and slave land and the start of freedom?" "Ain't exactly like that, Jabez," Mr. Peace went on. "The prairie just kind of continues one step pretty much the same as the last till we get into Indian country." "Indian country?" That got my attention right enough. Never have seen no Indians my entire life. That's on account of how the enlightened state of Missouri kicked 'em all out some years back, Simon. Sent 'em farther west. Government told 'em there'd be new lands there for them to hold forever. "And?" I asked. Mr. Peace sighed. "Well, now, forever in the mind of Indians and forever in the mind of white folks seems to be two entire separate things." "Enough about Indians," Jabez butted in. "When we gonna be in freedom country?" We hit the tiny village of Shawnee and moved on through. Once more on the open prairie on the other side, Mr. Peace slowed the mules and glanced down at Jabez. "That's it," he said. "What's it, Mr. Peace, sir?" "Why, Shawnee. It's as close as I can come to an exact marking line. Shawnee's in Kansas Territory for sure." "You mean?" Jabez stood stock still in the middle of the dusty road a long moment. Then he hitched up his newly broken-in boots and jumped a mighty leap. "I'm in freedom country! I'm free! I'm free! I'm a free man!" It felt kind of curious watching Jabez's enthusiasm over something I'd never thought much about before meeting my new friend. What if it was me in his boots? Well, I suppose I'd be mighty relieved too. I guess Mr. Peace figured the same, because soon he had come down off his perch on the wagon seat, and the three of us was dancing around and back-slapping to high heaven. It took us a while to settle down. Then we had to calm Emmett, who'd gone into a rare barking fit due to our antics. Next, we had to regather the flock, which had taken flight in fright. Jabez, he had a big grin plastered over his face straight into the evening. Added a couple inches to his height, too. He was walking that tall. And that's the way we traveled for the next few days, straight along the narrow, gritty trail that passed for a highway into Indian country. I was really waiting on my first sight of Indians. Didn't care how ferocious they looked. The wilder the better, far as I was concerned. I'd already met enough so-called civilized folks. This particular piece of land we was headed for belonged to the Potawatomi, Mr. Peace said, although there was some Shawnee and Kaw and Fox toward the south. The Potawatomi were supposed to be a peaceful sort of people who hunted a little and farmed a little and did whatever else was necessary to keep body and soul together. "What do they hunt for, Mr. Peace?" I asked one evening as we were settling into camp. "Why, buffalo, Simon." I stared long and hard over the wild, endless prairie spreading around us. Ain't seen anything like a buffalo. Nothing like the pictures in Miss Rogers's book. You sure they're still about, Mr. Peace? Sure they ain't all been done in by settlers and such?" Mr. Peace swiped at some dust on his cheek. "Well, I'll tell you. In the old days they was thick as flies in these parts. Going south from Independence on the Santa Fe Trail, why, we counted on 'em to keep us in meat. The Indians did too. They could take a buffalo and strip it down till there was nothing left but the fleas. Made their houses and clothing and blankets from the skins. Ate the meat and used the bones for tools. Wasn't enough leavings when they was done to tempt even a hungry vulture. I considered that information. Sounds like a useful sort of animal. It was. I hope it still is. Jabez had been listening the entire time. Meanwhile, he was polishing up his bowie knife. He looked up now with a gleam in his eye. Think I could get me one with this knife? Mr. Peace cut a grin. You see a buffalo with only that in your hand, Jabez? You better turn and run the other way. Fast. Why, how big could one be? Big, furry, and horned, and mean once their dander's up. Only thing'll take one down is a rifle. Jabez glanced toward the wagon where Paul's rifle was still stashed, along with Cleaver's revolver and their packs, all untouched since the day we'd acquired them. Maybe it'd be time to start learning about guns? Buffalo steak, Mr. Peace licked his lips. Liver for strength. Marrow soup. I could maybe get past my own gun feelings for that. Always used to tote one in the old days, anyhow. Why'd you stop, Mr. Peace? I asked. He gazed at me sorrowfully. Too much strong drink and guns don't go together, son. A man loses his perspective, starts to let off a little steam. Pretty soon somebody gets hurt. He stopped. Gave up guns when I took to serious drinking. At least I had enough sense for that. Jabez was listening to all this with an expression on his face as if gears and wheels were turning and clicking. So you do know how to make them work? Guns? Well, I should think so. And you've been stone cold sober the entire time we've been acquainted. Mr. Peace rubbed at his chin. I guess that's true. Jabez carefully resheathed his knife. That being the case, any reason why you couldn't give me some shooting lessons, Mr. Peace, sir? Lots. None of which I intends to go into now. And that's all we could get out of Mr. Peace on the subject of guns that entire night. The first shooting lesson commenced just past dawn the next morning. That was after Jabez and I woke up and continued our badgering campaign. Mr. Peace was every bit as reluctant to do it, using his fear of scaring the turkeys as an excuse, once he couldn't get past the fact that he was undoubtedly more sober than he'd been in 15 years. 15 years? That figure he let out caught my interest. You mean it was exactly 15 years ago you lost your loved ones? Mr. Peace nodded sadly. Ain't it strange that was happening right about the time I was being born? Can't be positive, but it seems like more than coincidence to me, Mr. Peace. The Lord took away, but he was given back at the same time. Only it was 15 years till all of us got together, almost like a real family. You and me and Jabez here. I swung toward my friend. Ain't you about 15 too? Born in 45, my mama always said. So there, I turned back to Mr. Peace triumphantly. So what? He complained. Fond as I am of you two boys, I can't say I see much logic behind your way of thinking. So you got at least part of a family back, Mr. Peace. And you ain't even looked crosswise at a saloon last few towns we passed through. Seems to me your perspective's right back where it belongs. I stopped for a breath and summed up. Which means there's no reason in this world you can't give Jabez and me a few shooting lessons. Mr. Peace slung his hat onto the ground and growled. I give up. Fetch the weapon. We left Emmett guarding the waking flock and tramped through a section of waist-high prairie grass till we figured out we was far enough from camp so the birds wouldn't be skittered. The trees had been thinning out remarkably the last few days of the journey, and the only thing left stretching around us was miles of flattish prairie and one lone cottonwood next to a creek. Here, Mr. Peace said, as there ain't no other targets at hand, we'll have to settle on that there tree. Jabez already had his hand stretched out for the rifle. Mr. P swatted it away. First, you got to learn about the basics, loading and proper handling. Why? Jabez was annoyed. He was itching to start shooting that poor little tree away leaf by leaf. Because guns ain't no joke, and I don't intend to be blown from this life premature. Not after it just started getting interesting again. Mr. Peace proceeded to waste an entire hour of travel time with those basics. Jabez and I, we listened, but after a while it got harder and harder to pay attention. Mr. Peace must have seen it, because he finally handed the weapon to Jabez. Here you go, son. Do your worst. Jabez fondled the loaded weapon for a minute like it was holy. Then he raised it up toward the tree. See that little branch hanging out over the creek to the right? What about it? I asked. Jabez aimed and pulled the trigger, just like that. The explosion near deafened me. After I finished blinking, that little branch wasn't there anymore. That's what. He handed the weapon to me, grinning. Your turn, Simon. I looked to Mr. Peace. He'd gone sort of pale all over. He swallowed. Go ahead, Simon. Loader, like Jabez said, it's your turn. I went through the entire procedure Mr. Peace had been explaining. Then I pointed to another branch and took my shot. The rifle barreled into my shoulder something fierce. I dropped the butt and rubbed at where it pained while opening my eyes hopefully. End result was that cottonwood had no need to be scared of me. Anybody see where the shot went? Mr. Peace pointed about 45 degrees across the prairie from the tree. Somewhere's over there. He slapped me on the back. Don't feel bad, Simon. We're not all born to be sharpshooters. After that, we let off another few rounds, then turned to head back to camp. Except we turned into unexpected company. There was a row of boys and men standing behind us, a half a dozen of them. Must have crept up mighty quietly out of nowhere. They was dressed in longish hair, leather pants, and ragged shirts almost worse than Jabez' old duds. Their faces were dark, too, but not like Jabez. Closer to the fine bronze of my turkeys than chocolate. I opened my mouth and shut it. I tried again. Indians? Looks like it, Simon, Mr. Peace said, real calm and collected. He lowered the rifle, now in his own left hand, and raised his right. How? Good morning, one of them answered. Fine morning for shooting. Sure is, Mr. Peace's Adam's apple wobbled. Aside from the fact that you are currently on Indian reservation lands where it is strictly illegal for any but tribal members to discharge weapons, Mr. Peace's right hand dropped. Well, now, I guess the boys and I ain't been careful enough about our geography. Why don't you gentlemen head back to camp with us for a little breakfast, and we can discuss our apologies over some beans and pan bread. The Indian in charge nodded, and we filed back through the grass. It was lucky Mr. Peace had set the big cauldron to simmer with beans before we'd gone off for our lessons. Now he gave it a mighty stir and pulled out the fry pan to start in on the hot bread. I broke into the corn and scattered some for the birds so they wouldn't start marching down the trail in advance of us. All this time our new acquaintances sort of poked around camp. Their leader was a man maybe about my pa's age, not quite as big, but looking to be hiding almost as much strength in the muscles beneath his faded blue shirt. Well, he started off admiring the horses. Then he and the others moved on to Sparky and his brothers. The younger Indians seemed real interested in the mules. Snowball even permitted a slim fellow to rub his ears before trying for a nip at the tooth bracelet dangling from his wrist. Lastly, Those Indians allowed themselves to comment on the existence of my turkeys. Meanwhile, Emmett kept a watchful eye on the lot of them. He wasn't real upset like the way he'd been with my paw and cleaver, more sort of on the alert, standing stiff on all four spindly bowed legs. Finally, we all hunkered down to the meal. I started in apologizing for the lack of proper plates, then shut my trap. The Indians were already solving the problem in the simplest way. They just took a hold of Mr. Peace's flatbread and scooped into the bean pot with it. We ate in silence till every bean and crumb of bread was gone. 3 pots of coffee, too, passing the cups around. It was real communal. The one in the faded blue shirt who talked to us at the start presently sank back on his haunches. I was kind of waiting for him to belch after consuming so many beans, but he didn't. Instead, he went and pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at his mouth and fingers before tucking it away again. So much for wild Indians. I thank you for your hospitality. His voice, after all the quiet, made me jump. You're probably wondering about us as much as we are about you and your unusual herd. His lips parted over white teeth. I am John Winterprairie, the John part courtesy of my teachers at Shawnee Mission as a boy. He motioned to his companions, all of them sprawled, comfortably digesting, but real alert nonetheless, sort of like Emmett. We are Potawatomi, much diminished from our great days in the wild rice country to the north, regrettably. But then our grandfathers made a few bad business deals with your great white father in Washington. That, coupled with smallpox and an unfortunate taste for your whiskey. He paused, and I stole a fast look at Mr. Peace. My drover was nodding in complete understanding. The Indian raised both palms. Such things do tend to change one's future. What we've got left is a small area of this Kansas prairie. Very small. You can understand how we might wish to hold on to such as is remaining to us, however humble it may be. However insignificant our roles may seem to the passing world. Jabez had been making himself near invisible, keeping very quiet during the entire meal. Now he apparently couldn't hold his tongue another moment. We didn't kill a single creature on your land, Mr. Winterprairie, sir. Not even a rabbit. We was just in mind of a little target practice, for maybe catching us a buffalo up ahead. There's been rustlers after us, too, and— Rustlers? The Indian's dark eyes gave Jabez a piercing look. Yes, sir, turkey rustlers. After Simon here's entire worldly goods. Got the best of 'em once already back in Missouri, but they's like slave catchers in determination. Some folks just don't ever understand that certain things is private property, like a man's soul. Jabez sat up straighter. Or these here lands of yours, which we didn't properly know was yours. But we'll be mighty pleased to vacate soon's we can hit the trail again, Mr. Peace finished. Paying you for any damage done fair and square, though I don't rightly think there was any, I tacked on. John Winterprairie smiled at last. It softened the fierceness of his hawk-like nose. You seem unusually honorable for men of the non-Indian persuasion. He swung to his feet in one graceful movement, as if they'd been poised on springs. His friends followed suit. Why don't we call your breakfast payment in full for any incursions unintentionally made? He studied us again, and I think I saw laughter in his eyes. There's not much to do out here after all, and we occasionally like to collect a little news of the world. Mr. Peace wiped sweat from his face. That's right neighborly of you gents. If you feel like another meal whilst we're still traversing your lands, feel free. Unfortunately, our lands do not extend much farther than another day's journey for you. We are compressed in a very tight box. And how much longer we have even this box is questionable. You mean you can't go beyond your lands? I blurted out. What if you need to hunt? For buffalo or something? Don't look for buffalo on Potawatomi lands or anywhere else nearby. The great beast is long gone from here. The herds of millions are nearly no more. I scratched my head. How could that be? Millions of buffalo ought to last forever. Ask your white hunters who kill them for sport, leaving their carcasses to rot. The Indian visibly checked his anger. But I think you aren't that sort of people. No, sir. No way. We all shook our heads with force. I thought not. You seem reasonable. He surveyed the camp again. Being reasonable men, you wouldn't care to trade for those 2 horses, would you? Not on your life, Mr. Peace blurted out. I mean, I appreciate your interest in them, Mr. Winter Prairie. I surely do, but they's the start of my herd for further out west. After we gets these turkeys to market in Denver. John Winter Prairie nodded. You have sound judgment in horseflesh. I wish you well in your travels. Then they was gone, disappeared into the grass. The entire lot of Potawatomi, without ever a peep from the rest of them. I turned to Mr. Peace. You sure they was Indians? I never heard nobody talk like that before, not even the preacher at church. And where was the feathers and moccasins and such? They wore boots, same as you and me. Mr. Peace shook his head. It's a frightening thing when even the Indians get civilized. A man don't know where he stands anymore. Still, Winter Prairie there was nice enough, even if he seemed to be doing a little jesting with us now and then. He poked his nose into the bean pot. Wasn't a thing strange about their appetites, though. His head bobbed up again. Maybe we ought to consider standing watch the next few nights anyhow. Those Potawatomi got themselves an inventory of our entire worldly goods. End of chapter 10.